Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion podcast series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. I am Khushi Hang, and in today's episode, PEI colleague Shuvangi is in conversation with Akhilesh Upadhaya on From the Margins of Power, exploring Nepali borderland communities. Akhilesh is researching the Himalayan borderlands. He is working on a book discussing the history of cross-border trade, migration, and family ties in the region. He also looks at the geopolitics of the Eastern Himalaya, where Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh share a crowded corridor with two big powers, India and China. He is a senior fellow with the Strategic Affairs Center at IIDS, a Kathmandu-based think tank. Shuvangi and Akhilesh explore Nepal's borderland communities' unique challenges and contributions. They discuss how federalism has reshaped governance and service delivery in these regions and examine the effects of cross-border politics and post-pandemic era restrictions on local livelihoods and trade. The conversation highlights how borderland communities are often excluded from national discussions despite their critical role in conflict management and cross-border relations. Like listening to Pods? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to the show. You can also follow us on Twitter at Tweet2PEI, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. for updates on the latest episodes. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello, Akhilesh sir. Welcome to Pods by PEI. I'm your host for today, Shuvangi Porjal.
Hi, Shuvangi. Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Okay, so we're here today to talk about the relationship between Kathmandu's power center and the borderland communities of Nepal, because I have a hypothesis that not only are they geographically at the peripheries of the country, but also in terms of policies and public service delivery. And this is something that I realized in the very early years as a researcher when I was doing some field work along the southern border districts of Nepal. And I felt that the conversations around governance are too Kathmandu-centric, and we tend to say Nepal but talk about Kathmandu. And this has since become a very important topic to me. It's very close to my heart. And I thought that as someone who travels extensively along both borderlands, you'd be the perfect person to speak to about all of this. So my first question is, how do you view borders?
That's a very interesting question and also a complex one. But broadly, I will try and deliver a few things I've observed at the borderlands. First of all, the way Kathmandu sees the borders, in the lack of a better terminology, I would call it imperial gaze. And there is sometimes in some of the policies, but also in discussions in the media, in the public sphere, especially in Kathmandu, the borderland and the people in the borderland communities and their issues are completely missed out. And I recently wrote an article in the Kathmandu Post, for example, the movement of elephants across the border. For elephants, there is no political boundary. Mm-hmm. And elephants cross over to very, very large stretch of land during their life cycle, also in annual cycle. For example, in Kakarbitta, or the Mechinagar, that the border point that touches the Indian Chicken Neck, West Bengal, herds of elephants travel as far away from as Assam, southern Bhutan, and West Bengal, then to Jhapa, Morong, Sunsari. That's how I've started calling elephant belt of Nepal, Jhapa, Morong, and Sunsari, because beyond that there's Big Koshi, mm-hmm. and elephants generally don't cross such huge rivers. But this side, it's kind of a happy hunting ground. So the reports I see from Kathmandu, or the Kathmandu press, or the press in general in Nepal, is the Indian elephants have come and marauded Nepali fields or Nepali farms. The elephants have no political boundary, have no idea of what political boundary is. Mm-hmm. Two, it is also not understanding the borderlands, which have a political demarcation, are actually a natural habitat of elephants for generations. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely anecdote. You spoke about elephants, but for people who are obviously affected by politics and these geographical demarcations and how this decides a lot of things for them, how do you perceive the geographical positioning of borderland communities in relation to Kathmandu? And do you think that this affects their visibility and voice in national discussions?
Oh, it does. I mean, like in Tarai, I give you example of Zappa just now, and let's go straight up north from Zappa, Ilam is also a bordering district, and further north, Panchthar is also a bordering district. Go further up, Olangchungola is even more interesting, say Taplejung, that it's a bordering district to both Tibet, to the north, and Sikkim to east, let's say northeast. The Kanchenjunga area, so-called, a lot of people can identify because it's the Kanchenjunga area, third highest peak in the world. When I went and talked to people in, say, northern stretches of Taplejung, not so much southern stretches, which is more, how they say, kind of like connected socially, politically with south, as in Nepal. The northern lands, very, very northern lands, the people came from Tibet, still speak this Tibetan language, and they go for shopping to Riu. Riu is a border town just across. In the villages, if you go further north in Tibet, their ancestors came from there, but they still have marital ties on that side. They'll have cousins, etc. So when I went for one of my researches to Olangchungola, this is a great anthropode in that part of the country or the world, I would say, even if you look at old history. While Tibet was disconnected, I went when the border was closed due to COVID, China, because of China's zero COVID policy. But Tibet was inseparable part of their conversation. Things like, okay, there's a mall there, we have families there. Akhilesh ji, you've come from Kathmandu, you speak different language from us, but those guys across speak the same language as we do. But there was also serious disconnect between how they thought and what. Forget Beijing, how the Beijing thought or Lhasa thought. This is what I mean. The borderland communities, because they inhabit that narrow stretches of land, oftentimes their voices do not travel as far as Kathmandu. Forget Beijing, which is like so far away, not even to Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. So there's a constant disconnect, while the yaks will have to graze on the pastures wherever it is lush green or where the best vegetation is. The voices and the needs of these communities, say need for pasture land, need for shopping, it's winter and they need warm quilts to buy in markets of Riu. I mean, it is not seen as urgent in Kathmandu because I've actually heard some people say, politician, why are you talking about borderland communities? Only a few people live there, My idea was because only few people live there, their voices are lost in Kathmandu. Not just in Kathmandu, even in Taplejung headquarters, that's Phungling, because the southern Taplejung is more populated, and the people who get elected are, of course, from southern Taplejung, right? Same with Mustang. People who represent Mustang are not from borderline areas, who are Tibetan Buddhist, followers of Tibetan Buddhism, People who represent Mustang are usually Thakalis who live in Chomsom and the more densely populated areas, Yogesh Ji is now currently the Nepali Congress young MP, perhaps the youngest in parliament currently. If not the youngest, definitely one of the youngest. He comes from southern Mustang. And when I go to Mustang, as in Upper Mustang, and here these Tibetan communities are like followers of, let's not say Tibetan, followers of Tibetan Buddhism say, we don't get heard. Forget in Kathmandu, not even in Chomsom. That is the district headquarters of Mustang.
Exactly. So you're saying there's not only a dissonance between borderland communities of Nepal and Kathmandu, but even the local government, they're not responsive to the borderland communities and their issues in Nepal.
Yeah. I would say, Shuvangi, it's almost a vicious cycle. Because the community is small, they are not heard. And because they are not heard, they're also kind of like migration. One of the things I see as a constant refrain each time I travel to borderland communities, there's a huge migration. And one of the enduring picture I bring to mind is locked doors, with some places actually having those old traditional botetalsa on the door, And some have, of course, some do migrate seasonally. It's super cold out there, in say, Upper Mustang. A lot of people, a lot of families travel down to Jomsom or Pokhara or even to Kathmandu or Beni, etc., adjoining areas. But a lot of them have left for good. So the reason I say it's a vicious cycle is, one, there is lack of opportunity. And because there is a lack of opportunity, numerical representation is low because the population is small. And because the population is small and the political representation is almost negligible, there is no constituency to talk about their issues. And that makes opportunity even less for them. So it's a kind of vicious cycle that I see borderland communities getting caught up in.
Wow,
especially in northern lands. Not so much in south as in Tarai borderlands, where the population is pretty decent. Yeah, also the opportunities compared to the northern borderlands. But the northern borderlands faces acute migration problem and population, crisis.
We'll definitely get into both Southern Borderland District and Northern Borderland District and their unique issues. But you've slightly touched on this. I was curious to see if, the adoption of the federal, three-tier federal system of Nepal, we had high hopes from this. Has it influenced borderland communities positively? Has there been any change you've observed in public service delivery, efficiency, or lack of?
That's a good one. My research, that's a good one. I am trying also to piece things together beyond anecdotes on this. And I would like to qualify very early on that I haven't quite looked at federalism vis-a-vis, borderland vis-a-vis federalism, but I can share some anecdotal stories. I would say for example, Tarai borderland, kind of like, say, Zhapa, the areas that I travel most for my research. Also a place I was born in, because the population density is quite good in these borderland areas, their voices in federated state system that we have now adopted is comparatively a lot more stronger than, say, northern borderland, where, as I said, the villages, again, going back to the example, the villages are so remote, so distant, let's not use the word remote, so distant from Phungling district headquarters, and also the population size is so small, the representation in village municipality becomes less. So I can see, because of that, issues of service delivery, because from Phungling, I don't know, it's probably 2 days walk to some of these distant communities. So service delivery is, of course, an issue. When I was coming back in one of my trips from Olangchungola, this one, again, a major entrepot back in heydays of Nepal-Tibet border, I found a mother, infant child had been bitten by a dog, take a jeep, first of all stop over at this Iladana for a night and take a jeep next morning just to get an injection for her infant son. So you can see the service delivery is super challenged despite the federated system, because of, again, relative distance of these borderlands from centers of, administrative centers, but also health centers, etc.
Right. You spoke a little bit about the COVID-19 and China's zero COVID policy and how that hampered a lot of things. But one of the things that it did do is hamper the business communities along the northern border of Nepal, because, there were trucks stuck at the border, and even when they were able to move the trucks, the products inside the truck were pretty much useless. And this is where you think, how does the government step in situations like this? So did the government of Nepal or China ever have a discussion about these affected traders, or was there any effort to provide compensation of some sort for these traders? How do you think that these things then reflect the priorities of our policymakers, decision makers in Kathmandu?
Okay. A few things there. I would highlight some points. First of all, Nepal's land trade. A lot of Nepal major exports still come from the ports, but let's say Nepal's land border. Tato Pani and, these are major ports. And at least what happens there gets reported in the press and hence discussed in parliament and political circle. I'm not saying this wasn't bad. Let me back up. Because Nepal-China's relations is so asymmetrical, it's always Beijing that decides when the border is going to be closed or open. I must, as much as I have tried to understand the dynamics of this, not just as a Borderland researcher in recent years, 3 or 4 years, but also earlier in my earlier avatar as a newspaper editor for 10 years, it's always the Chinese side that decides when the border is going to be closed and when it is going to be open. And that is very much a fundamental that we will do well to understand. Kathmandu has very little influence over when China or Beijing decides to open these various border crossings, when it decides to close. That's number 1 point. Number 2, even within that dynamic, at least the major border points, because they handle a lot of trade, bilateral trade between Nepal and China, they get reported in Nepal's press. If, say, X number of Apple trucks are stranded on that side, or lots of cargo, let's say clothes for Dasai, or shoes, etc., or furniture are stranded on that side. Now, increasingly, of course, EV is China's major export now from these 2 border points, Tatopani and Kerung. And that gets reported in press, I can see. But the borderland communities, their issues are seldom highlighted because it's a tiny community and it's not a powerful community again. And that gets very little space in our, not just news, but also public space. When I go to foreign policy forums here, this is something like I have been raising for last several years now. It's always Kathmandu Beijing and Kathmandu Lhasa trade that features high on the agenda, but not concerns of borderland communities. Again, for the reason I mentioned earlier, because it's a small community comparatively, and it's also not a politically powerful community. So while Nepal is already marginalized vis-a-vis in discussion with Beijing because of huge asymmetry, given the size of our economy, but various other things. But the issues of borderland communities and issues of concern for them, say pastures, sharing of pastures, people on this side being allowed to go to that side, or little exports, whatever they can export to that side, they seldom feature in our discussion in public sphere.
Yeah, our discussions are more overburdened by topics like border violations or like India trying to damage Nepal's sovereignty in some way. It's all about like land and borders, but never about the people along the land and borders. I remember when this Lipu Lake, Limpuyadhara was at its peak, this conversation, it was never about the people there. It was always about, this treaty says that if the river flows in this way, this land belongs to Nepal. It has never once been about the people who live along those borders and how that can create complications for them. Why and what do they think about it?
That's very interesting you mentioned that. So in one of our episodes, she did Vidya Chapagai. She put it brilliantly. She talked to people in the region beyond Kalapani or around there. And she said, I would ask Kathmandu people to stop talking about this. First of all, link us through Darchula headquarters and give us a unhindered passage to Nepal. Then mention it, because we are at mercy of Indian border guards at on that area, and we're not even allowed to go there, because we have to go there to come into Nepal, but also for our shopping. And this is something I see when I go to Darchula, for example. Darchula is closed. If the border, there's this small border bridge, if it is open, Darchula is never closed. So there may be a border blockade in Nepal, but if Darchula, that small bridge that connects Darchula to Dharchula, just across Mahakali, if it's open, they can go and do all the shopping. It's much bigger, of course, Dharchula than Darchula, our Darchula headquarters of Darchula. But this is the thing about borderland communities, And I can see when little things happen in Darchula area, newspapers or news websites here, or like even politicians in Kathmandu who don't understand oftentimes the intricacies of borderland communities, talk in such ultra nationalistic terms, what happens on the ground, that it adversely impacts people there. It's very important when you talk about this to understand the sentiments of borderland communities and how the decisions you make, the political rhetoric you may use in Kathmandu will adversely impact the people in these borderland communities. And there is this lack of understanding I see over and over in the way the foreign policy again is viewed from a strong Kathmandu gaze, imperial gaze, when we are discussing these issues.
Yeah, this perfectly brings me to my next question, because right after the COVID-19 pandemic is when I was doing my field research along the southern border of Nepal. And, this was at a time where in Kathmandu, they were talking about the spillover effects of COVID-19 and how had the border been regulated or not open, then Nepal would not have had to face the wrath of COVID in the way that it did. And there was a lot of blaming, all of that. That was there. But what was most, as a foreign policy observer and as a researcher, what struck me is how they're talking about, policymakers in Kathmandu are talking about regulating the India-Nepal border. They're talking about possibly completely changing how the open border looks right now, without taking into consideration or without even bringing representation from the borderland communities, the people of which will be the ones who will be most affected by it. Because, roti, beti, we talk about this, but we say that because it is a big part of Nepal-India relations and has been for many centuries. And this is about how borderland communities are not only kept away from national decisions, but also decisions that affect them the most. So what are your insights on how these policies disproportionately affect them, but how these policies are formulated, and what needs to change, maybe?
I'm glad you're asking this. I was born in Bhadrapur, and Bhadrapur is bang on Mechi border, and I used to play cricket in my adolescence at Bhadrapur High School cricket ground, and we used to joke among friends, if I hit a boundary 4, the ball will probably travel from Bhadrapur High School to the bordering Indian town of Galgalia, and it's more rhetorical device. It actually doesn't, because there's Mechi River in between. So what I'm saying is, when the borderland people in Kathmandu, say MPs or foreign policy discussions, often happen not just among politicians but also media. There's a lot of synergy in what media says and how politicians articulate their ideas and vice versa, right? There is lack of understanding about how intimate these ties are at the people-to-people level, but also, because they are so intimate, how complex they are. So this multifaceted nature of the bilateral ties is often ignored by people who haven't had the lived experience or understanding of the borderland. In fact, I encourage, each time I joke with some of the MPs, you should all, especially who are speaking in parliament and foreign policy, should have a crash course and live in borderland communities for 3 months. And you begin to understand, how, for example, in the, say, rice plantation season, how when there's a lack of fertilizer distributed, or maybe they can't obtain from, say, the center, or this, when I say center, Kathmandu or district headquarters or wherever, Nepali market, they just go across the border and get it. And they'll just bring it in bicycle. And people who are in the borderland, including the police and the border guards, whoever they understand this. They let them be. I can just kind of visualize. The guy is bringing in a sack of fertilizer, and the border guard will pretend as if he's chasing, and he'll pretend as if he's running away from him. So neither is he chasing in genuine sense, neither is he running in a genuine sense. So this is the complexity. But if you kind of go from with a Kathmandu gaze, you'll see, the border is so loose. These guys are not doing their work. Or the guy is smuggling fertilizers across the border. But these are little intricacies that come into play when we talk about people, especially in Tarai, in borderland communities, but also in northern borderland. These things have been happening for generations, and there is a serious lack of this understanding of what goes on the ground in some of the people who kind of talk about foreign policy issues and have actually influence on foreign policy issues. And I would say, if I don't know how appropriate it would be, especially MPs and politicians of power who come from Pahadi districts, they must do a 3-month crash course in these borderland communities. Let's say it could be a really enlightening experience for them to actually go and spend time there, not surrounded by their karyakartas all the time, but more with the common people. Why do they depend on the markets next door, and how is the cross-border marriages, how do they take place, and half the families on this side of Kakarbita, other half is in Panitanki. What do you do? I mean, like, your uncle lives on this side, one of the cousins lives on this side, and you're constantly traveling back and forth within a day, So these intricacies often is very often not well understood by a lot of policymakers. Especially, I would like to qualify, it's a half joke, people who belong to Pahadi district.
I completely agree with you on that. And when talking about trying to understand borderland communities, we also need to understand that they're not some kind of victims, but they also have significant roles that they've been playing for centuries. For example, borderland communities serve as the first line of defense for every country. And in your recent Human article, and you've also touched on your article, you've spoken about how rapid response teams, often made up of local residents, they play a crucial role in managing immediate conflicts. And the government authorities are often distant when all of this is happening. So can you elaborate on the significance of these borderland communities, not only in this role, but other vital contributions that they make that are often overlooked in mainstream discourse?
Yeah, I'm glad you read this article. I found it so interesting when I was spending some time in, again, this borderland community just by Mechi River, Boundangi, which is entry point to herds of elephants that come from India, and also when they go back. Let's say this is the ground zero of elephant movement in West Bengal and Zappa corridor. Because when the elephants come into the villages, the people who are most affected are the villagers themselves. And there is a protocol that we are supposed to, whenever something happens, inform the local, CDO or district forest officer. And I recorded at least one instance when a baby elephant was in serious distress, probably like less than a month old. You probably know that elephants, before they start using their trunk, they rely entirely on the herd, especially the mother, because elephant trunk muscles are so complex, they take months to develop. So they are completely reliant on their mother for their survival. So one of the members of the rapid response team, he was alerted and he understood that the baby has to be saved and there's no time to lose. And the whole elephant herd kept guard of the distressed mother and the baby for the whole night, hoping that the baby would be able to again get up and walk and cross over the Mechi River and go to the safety of the jungle in India, that's nearby. As day broke, more people gathered. There was a lot of noise. The herd slowly started. And the mother was the only person, mother, so beautiful, was the only person trying to defend this calf, elephant calf, her child, right? But even she left because she couldn't do it, yeah? And they tried to inform, the rapid response team by this time had gathered also from across the Mechi River from India. So they tried to naturally, as the protocol is, inform the CDO and DFO. The DFOs, I was told, his only concern was the story shouldn't get out to the media. It should not become a big news in Kathmandu. While for them, for the rapid response team, such a beautiful cross-border mechanism with locals from either side, they understand that they are the first line of defense, but also first line of attack in this case of elephants. So it is in their interest to alert their villages if there's a wild elephant going on a rampage, but also to defend these baby elephants because they feel that it is their heritage. It is something that they feel so strongly attached to. Forget Kathmandu, Chandragadi, which is the district headquarters of Zappa, it doesn't get it. For them, it is still distant. It's just a few kilometers away, but issue is still distant for them. For them, there is no luxury to waiting, it'll be morning and then we'll try and do something about it. Whenever such emergency situations happen, rapid response team, I found out they would come into operation middle of the night or whenever such emergencies happen, because for them, it's an immediate priority. They don't have the luxury to wait until the next morning, next month, for Chandragiri, Biratnagar, which is the provincial headquarters of Kosi province, where Zappa is, or Kathmandu to wake up next morning or next month, or the parliament to take up these issues, So I can see that there's a serious disconnect between the problems, issues, and aspirations of the people in the borderland and how Chandragiri, Biratnagar, or Kathmandu views them.
You mentioned the media and how the authority, his main concern was how this should not be picked up by the media and Kathmandu does not need to know about this. This brings me to my question. Not only but it is definitely the role of media. It is the responsibility of media, especially in a democracy, to cover marginalized faces, issues, achievements, all of it. But like you said, when it does get covered, it's not really centered around the people, but on other concerns that Kathmandu is interested in. So as a borderland researcher and also as someone with an extensive experience in journalism, who's also writing a book on Eastern Himalaya and borderland communities and issues and their issues, how do you perceive the role of Nepali media? Have they been adequately representing marginalized communities, their stories, their faces? What's your view on this?
Okay, I'm glad, in recent times, I see more and more coverage in major newspapers, Kantipur, Annapurna Post, Kathmandu Post, recent years, of concerns of borderland community and recent issues. This is really heartening to see that. But that doesn't take away the fact that oftentimes when I talk to newspaper editors, common refrain is, no one lives there, and hence there is no story. Now, for any country's sovereignty, yes, there is population, but there is also geography. Mm-hmm. And don't forget, these places, are, say, Taplejung, there's enormous biodiversity there. You'll see rhododendron forests, you'll see yak herds, so much the reason that these need to be protected. So even when there is not enough people, my earlier thesis of these communities getting caught up in vicious cycle, because there is not enough people to talk about them, hence the role of the media even more urgent, no? If there is community to talk about it, perhaps the media doesn't need to take up that issues, Media is supposed to give to the voice to the marginalized, to the people who are not often at the center stage of public discourse. That, I think, is one of the fundamental, reasons that in a democracy, media's role becomes so vital. But also you are protecting not just that, the biodiversity in the region, which is also extremely important. It's the same case in northern Sikkim or Siliguri, the biggest city in the Chicken Neck corridor in West Bengal. It is not in the mainstream Indian discourse. It is not even Calcutta's discourse, perhaps. Kind of like areas like Darjeeling, Kalimpong, Sikkim, but also northern Sikkim, issues of valleys in northern Sikkim, and how yak herds are depleting. And because yak herds are not getting to travel to Tibetan borderland and vice versa, the gene pool of yak has severely depleted. And according to an ICIMOD report I read, in Tibet and Qinghai, that's a province adjoining to Tibet, do you find yak in the wild now? So the gene pool has depleted because these nomads or semi-nomads who used to travel freely, say in Bhutan, the Eastern Himalayas, Sikkim, Tibet, Nepal. Because the border has become hard, you are Nepali, you are Sikkimese, Indian, you are Bhutanese, you are Chinese, So which is sad enough, but sadder still is the story of the yaks. They have also been ascribed citizenship. You are Chinese yak, you are Nepali yak, you are Bhutanese yak, you are a Sikkimese yak. So there's a serious need to look into this issue as to how much disservice we are doing in the name of a nation to this wonderful, how would I say, kind of heritage, but also the fact that many of these things have been handed down to us for generations. And then political boundaries for flora and fauna means nothing. But also borderland communities who are so reliant on each other, because they were there, they have been living there before the idea of Westphalian state came into being. Westphalian state demanded that, you are a Nepali, you have to speak this way, you have to wear this way, and you can only kind of like seek help from Phungling or Chandragadi or Biratnagar or Kathmandu, not so much to the communities just across the border. And the whole cycle of dependence has to be broken because you are Chinese, you're Indian, don't rely on the communities next door, And I see that also in, how would I say, breakdown of social ties. For example, when I was talking to someone in Taplizung, someone got married, let's say a girl from Tibet came to this side, and because she liked the guy, they got married. But her parents from Tibet came and forcibly took the girl back, because you as a Tibetan or Chinese are not supposed to marry a Nepali. But they are both from the same community, they like each other, but that's not reason enough to get married. There's also a bit of economic factor in recent years about how Tibet has, especially in terms of economic progress, has really advanced compared to borderland community and Nepali sides. But still, to me, it is not reason enough to kind of separate people, who by their own, how would I say, kind of interest wanted to get married. And then parents would say, okay, if we don't take them away, I was interviewing local village leader as to say, what is the price for the boy not agreeing to give the girl away, his wife, let's say, or a partner. Or there's a huge price that her family will have to pay in Tibet. So this is increasingly this idea of seamless border versus hard border, and as we say in international relations term, hard border, deciding kind of like norms and way of life for the common people or the people who have lived in either side of the border. Either side of, I would now like to qualify increasingly what has now been the international border. Don't forget, when it was only after PRC, People's Republic of China, say, especially after 40s, 49, 50s, Tibet came under strong control of China. Until then, a lot of these borderland areas didn't have a pronounced boundary, honestly. Even on the Nepal side. And I was talking to someone doing my research, a very, very long interview, and he said, we decided to come to Nepal, but we also brought land to Nepal when he decided that we were Nepalese. So you guys actually, when he was telling me, you guys actually got land with us, territory with us. So this whole idea of territoriality in borderland is hugely questionable. What is Tibet? What is Nepal? What is China? So, I'm giving you a very, very ground perspective, People in Kathmandu may not always appreciate this school of thought and argument.
But that's exactly why we're here and talking about this in such depth. You've mentioned both of our neighbors, and I think it would be impossible to talk about our borderland communities without talking about how geopolitics affects them. So we've seen interventionist, counter-interventionist behaviors from both of our neighbors, and then it plays out in Nepal. And sometimes how I see it personally is that the grievances of borderland communities are often leveraged by our more powerful neighbors for their own strategic interests. We saw it unfold in 2015. Even then, the mainstream media discourse was almost trying to villainize borderland communities, and then suggesting that borderland communities stand to benefit from these geopolitical dynamics in the region where, let's say our neighbors sort of challenge our sovereignty or whatever. There's this perception here. I am of the thinking, I personally don't believe that. I think that there are political ramifications within Nepal that adversely affect borderland communities rather than them benefiting from these geopolitical happenings. What are your views on that?
This is a complex one. I would say kind of like Let's say, I can only offer specific examples. Issue with I just discussed is definitely one of them. And then the way, while the word imperial gaze, the terminology was earlier coined by the way imperialists looked at the global south, I'm increasingly begin to use this word in the way Beijing, Delhi looks at even the smaller states within the global south, in this case South Asia, say Bhutan and Nepal. But to go further down, I would even say the way Kathmandu and Thimphu looks at their own borderland communities, because these places are not hugely populated and they become international news. Places like Doklam, for example, when there's a standoff between Delhi and Beijing for this, kind of piece of land, strategic piece of land, highland that overlooks the Indian Chicken Neck. And then China wants this, so is the story. The borderland communities or the borderland geography come into the national and international limelight, say Kathmandu's gaze or Delhi's gaze or Beijing's gaze, or even beyond, say Washington, London, or even beyond that, or United Nations gaze, when they come into, how would I say, this geopolitical theater. Oh, it's interesting, Doklam. There are also people who live there. There are also people who own yak herds there. There are farms there. Not exactly, maybe Doklam is such a high plateau. I'm not too sure about that. But many of these borderland communities. So I don't see the dynamic that is discussed, say, in Kathmandu or Delhi or Beijing, intricate issues of, say, food security, need for getting pastures for yaks when there is more, say, vegetation available on either side of the whichever side of the border on a particular months of the year, or issues of need to get kind of daily commodities if you're living in, say, Olangchum Gola or Mustang and have to cross over to Kolrala border to buy, I don't know, daily ration to get to stores in Lomanthang, These news don't often, the need or urgency of the need don't often travel to the capitals. And they come into news only when they're like, especially big, say, border issues, a border dispute. Then suddenly they take strong significance in the national discourse, much, much beyond their immediate geography, which is really unfortunate.
So my final question, it's a broad one. As a researcher, as a journalist, as a person, what would you like to tell the decision makers here in Kathmandu and regarding borderlands and borderland communities?
I would say that when you make policy and when you talk in parliament or the national stage, and, as someone like who's analyzed the, how would I say, kind of like interface between political rhetoric and policies, they have such synergy. What you kind of like use in your political rhetoric become policy. Oftentimes there's not enough synergy, but more often than not there is in a democracy. Don't be trigger happy, please. Keep in mind what you say. The borderland communities, if you're talking about Humla, keep in mind how is that going to impact borderland communities, Tilarakot. When you're talking about Taplejung or kind of like northern borderland issues in general, keep in mind how will that impact the borderland communities there. If you're talking about conservation, talk to people in Zappa, especially where the elephant problem is everyday occurrence almost in some of the villages. Talk to them. Travel there. Don't rely totally on what gets reported in the media and assume that is a sacrosanct or there's only story there is. Travel there, talk to local communities there, and you're going to get to know a very different side of story you had otherwise not assumed there was. It's very, very important. And I often see in these Kathmandu-centric debates or Delhi-centric debates or whichever capital-centric debates, the issues the local communities look at it versus how Kathmandu or Delhi looks at it is very, very different, sometimes almost diametrically opposite. So this comes because of your lack of understanding of local sensitivities and local stories.
Wow, that was wonderful. I personally had a great time. Did you enjoy our episode?
Yeah, I did. I mean, it's a privilege, honestly, to talk about issues so dear to my heart. And it doesn't always find the space in, not just in Nepal, even beyond Nepal.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to find this synergy and do this episode. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Shuvangi's conversation with Akhilesh on From the Margins of Power, Exploring Nepali Borderland Communities. Today's episode was produced by Nirjan Rai with support from Bibhuti Bhatta and me, Khushi Hang. The episode was recorded at PEI Studio and was edited by Bibhuti Bhatta. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakya from Zindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leaving a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepali politics and policy, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI. That's TWEET followed by the number 2 and PEI, and on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Khushi. We will see you soon in our next episode.